Good evening, everyone. I'm Neil Lane. I'm a very long-term faculty member at Rice and a senior fellow here at the Baker Institute. It's my very pleasant duty to welcome all of you to Rice University and the Baker Institute for our annual Civic Scientist Lecture with today's distinguished civic scientist, Sylvia Earle. This evening's lecture is part of the Baker Institute's Civic Scientist program, which highlights outstanding scientists and engineers and other technical professionals who, in addition to making significant contributions to all of their fields, also devote a portion of their careers to public service, either by working in government or working in education or by many other means. Our goal is to encourage others to follow in the footsteps of these wonderful examples, and more generally, we want to promote a dialogue to help bridge the divide that sadly still exists, at least in this country, between science and rational public policy making. The word rational is a little used these days. We're endeavoring to spread the word about the vital link between science and the public good through both this lecture series and our outreach program, which last year sent a dozen scientists and engineers to local middle and high schools, reaching over 1,000 students. Prior to today's lecture, the Civic Scientist series has hosted 8 prominent speakers to Rice, including Subra Suresh, outgoing director of the National Science Foundation, Shirley Ann Jackson, former chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Bruce Alberts, former president of the National Academy of Sciences and currently editor-in-chief of Science Magazine, Jane Lubchenco, outgoing administrator of NOAA, Arden Bement, former NSF director, David Baltimore, Nobel laureate and former president of Caltech, and Alice Wong, both David and Alice well-known, distinguished biomedical researchers and have been very involved in the public sphere. And Robert Curl and Harry Croteau. Bob Curl being a Rice Nobel laureate, and who with Harry and with the late Richard Smalley discovered carbon-60, which launched a whole new era of fullerene chemistry. I cannot think of a better name to add to this list than that of Sylvia Earle, who among her many other accomplishments is simply saving the Earth's oceans. All the living things in them, the sustenance that they provide, and the beauty that we all enjoy and that we want our grandchildren and their grandchildren to be able to enjoy in the future. But before introducing Dr. Earle, I want to thank those who made this evening's event possible through their generous sponsorship. The Civic Scientist program receives enthusiastic support from Rice, specifically the Weiss School of Natural Sciences with Dean Dan Carson. In addition, I want to give special thanks to Rice alum Janice Hartrick and her JWC-JKH Family Foundation for their considerable support of our program, and Shell Oil Company for supporting this lecture series as well as the Baker Institute Shell Distinguished Lecture Series. In addition, I want to acknowledge our special supporters of today's lecture, the Hart Research Institute Foundation, the Hart family and Meredith Montgomery, the Nature Conservancy, the Rice Center for the Study of Environment and Society, and its director and Baker scholar Andre Droxler, who's here this evening, as well as the Severe Storm Prediction, Education, and Evacuation from Disasters Center, which is more easily described as SSPEED, and its director, Phil Bedian. Today's speaker is Dr. Sylvia Earle. She is called Her Deepness by the New Yorker and the New York Times, a living legend by the Library of Congress, and is Time Magazine's first hero for the planet. Sylvia Earle, over her career, has led more than 100 expeditions as an oceanographer and explorer, authored probably over 180 publications, and lectured in 80 countries. Her title is Explorer in Residence of the National Geographic Society. Some say she's the modern and female Jacques Cousteau. She is also the leader of Sustainable Seas Expeditions, Council Chair for the Hart Research Institute, founder of Mission Blue and the Sea Alliance, and formerly Chief Scientist of NOAA. Earle is founding Ocean Elder, patron of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and has served on several corporate and non-profit boards, including Kerr-McGee, Dresser Industries, Oryx Energy, World Wildlife Fund, U.S. and International, Aspen Institute, Conservation International, and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and I'm sure more. Dr. Earle has 22 honorary doctorates and more than 100 national and international awards, including the 2009 TED Prize, the Netherlands Order of the Golden Ark, the Academy of Achievement, and in 2011, the Dominican Republic's Medal of Honor, the Royal Geographical Society's Patrons Medal, and Australia's Sims Green Leadership Award. One of my special memories in the White House was the day my secretary came in and said, Dr. Sylvia Earle is on the line. Yeah, do you have time to talk? And I said, of course. And so I picked up the phone and I said, where are you? And I think Sylvia said something like, well, I'm 20 meters below the Atlantic Ocean in the Aquarius, which is NOAA's underwater reef laboratory. Well, I hadn't had a chance to visit Aquarius, so that was the phone call was as close as I had a chance to come. But getting a call from Sylvia Earle, whether under the water or above the water, is always a great thrill for anyone, and we are delighted that she could be with us today. So please welcome Dr. Sylvia Earle.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. After listening to that long list of distinguished predecessors at this podium, I'm grateful for having had some experience of working under pressure. Really, it's such an honor to be here at this university, at this institution. When I was chief scientist at NOAA, Secretary Baker was Secretary of State, and the world, it was only 20 years ago, was a very different place. In fact, I tell people sometimes that I come from a different planet because the planet I originated on more than 20 years ago was so different than the one that we now know. And we could start the little video clip here anytime you'd like. I guess I can do that. Let's see. Can you hear me in the back to start the video? There we go. This view didn't exist when I was a child, but now anyone can basically hold the world in his or her hand. Kids can do it, carry around in their cell phones in their pockets more information than all the great minds of years past. Galileo, Einstein, name the big brains of the past, could not know what we now know. I show this picture sometimes. In fact, I showed it at the World Bank when I gave a talk there a few weeks ago, and I said, there it is, the World Bank. And like a lot of other banks, we've been drawing down the assets, and now we know it's not too big to fail. In fact, that's the problem that now faces us. A year ago, I had an opportunity to go speak at Davos at the World Economic Forum. I was so pleased that they gave time and space to talk about that World Bank that we all draw down with every breath we take, that we are using the assets. But now we know what we couldn't know not so long ago, are able to see what we're doing to the world. And when I was a kid, I was inspired by early explorers such as William Beebe, who wrote a book called Half Mile Down, and he took the plunge off the coast of Bermuda at the top of this mountain. It's an undersea mountain, but the top sticks out, and we call it Bermuda. He went about a half a mile beneath the surface with his friend and colleague, engineer Otis Barton, going as deep as some whales can dive holding their breath. Actually, sperm whales can go as much as a mile. That was a humpback whale that just flitted across the screen. But imagine crawling into a steel ball like this and going down into the depths below where sunlight penetrates, hanging on a string, a thread, hoping that it stays secure. they had a lot of problems, and it took several years before they actually succeeded in getting the first views of what it is like, as much as, half a mile, 1,000 meters beneath the surface. And there they saw for the first time creatures such as these that migrate from the deep sea up to the surface at night. And they feed on the bounty, the photosynthesis that's accumulated, and then they sink back during the day. Creatures that live only in the ocean, that for the first time human eyes really witnessed in the deep sea. And the phenomenon of bioluminescence, living light. We sometimes think that we have new means of communication that are for the first time connecting people around the world, and that's true with people, but creatures in the sea have used sound and light to communicate for millions of years, and we're just beginning to tune in to what it's like out there and down there. And if I could, I wouldn't be standing here with all of you talking about the ocean. We'd be scooped up in a big submarine, and we'd be down looking at the ocean firsthand. And I hope, if you haven't already put on a mask and flippers at least, don't do what my mother did. She waited until she was 81. And then she did take the plunge and scolded me ever after. Don't wait until you're 81. If you are 81, don't wait any longer. There's still time. As long as you breathe, you can explore the blue part of the planet. If you don't like to get wet, there are passenger submarines that can take you there. But don't miss a chance to go see that part of the planet that really dominates the way the world works. Now we know. Early in the 20th century, for the first time, we began to realize that we had the power to eliminate whole ecosystems from the land. And Teddy Roosevelt was among the heroes of the time who took measures as president to establish areas on the land, creating what some regard as the best idea America ever had, that is the national park system. And now, early in the 20th century, we have, thanks to policies that were established in this country in the 1970s, that make it possible to do something like that in the ocean as well. And in the Gulf of Mexico, this beloved body of water that I got to know as a kid living in Florida, it's where I first personally took the plunge with 2 words of instruction: breathe naturally, with a scuba tank on my back. You wouldn't consider doing that today with all the new means of learning about the pros and cons of what you have to do, but breathing naturally is pretty good advice, whether you're on the surface or underwater. I used to look out over the Gulf and wonder if I would ever get to see what was on the other side, to see Mexico. Well, in recent years, I have actually had many opportunities to go see the other side of the Gulf of Mexico, to meet the people who see the Gulf looking in the other direction, and to go even to Cuba and to visit with the people who have a shared interest in this big, beautiful, blue body of water that both connects all of us. In some ways, it holds us apart. But I like to think of the connecting part mostly. Not just the Gulf. The Gulf is a microcosm of the whole world. Now we know what we could not know when I was a child, that the ocean delivers most of the oxygen in the atmosphere, takes up most of the carbon dioxide, and holds it in place. And it's where most of life on Earth is, and certainly it's where most of the water is. 97% of Earth's water is out there in the ocean. Fortunately, there is salt water out there in the ocean. It goes up in the atmosphere, falls back on the land as rain, and recharges the rivers, lakes, and streams. People ask me sometimes, why should I care about the ocean? If it dried up tomorrow, what difference would it make? And I say, well, okay, do you like to breathe? That's where most of the oxygen comes from. Do you like water that magically falls out of the sky? Well, that's where most of the water comes from. Take away the ocean, you've got a planet a lot like Mars, not a very hospitable place for us. Well, now we know. The ocean matters. The ocean, with every breath we take, every drop of water we drink. We are connected to the sea. It doesn't matter where on Earth we are. We may never touch the ocean, those who live far inland, but the ocean touches every one of us. Every one of us, in a way, is a sea creature, because like any dolphin or whale or coral reef or whatever it is that you think of, a giant squid, dependent on the sea, so are we. No ocean, no life. No blue, no green. We have to take care of the ocean. We didn't have to do this years ago because the ocean pretty much took care of itself. Rachel Carson wrote about this in The Sea Around Us in the mid-1950s. We all imagined at the time that the ocean was too big to fail. But now with 7 billion of us putting pressure on the natural systems that keep us alive, we know that we have to be conscious about what we do to those systems, the air, the diversity of life, and certainly the ocean. Well, I consider myself so fortunate, and so are you, to be born at this magical point in time when we know what we know. If only we could take what we know and go back 50 years or 100, we might have a better chance of sorting things out in terms of finding an enduring place for ourselves within the systems that keep us alive. But the best we can do is take the knowledge we now have, armed with that, and going forward, make decisions in ways that will give us the best chance we'll ever have. I love to dive, and I am so pleased that I came along at a point when it is possible. William Beebe and Otis Barton in the 1930s didn't have the benefit of scuba, not even face masks or fins. All of that has come in the 20th century after their time. I have had the joy, as you can have the joy as well, of diving in, getting to see the little creatures up close and personal. You can see the fish swimming in something other than lemon slices and butter, swimming in the ocean, you know? You can go to an aquarium. I consider them to be halfway houses for fish and people. You can see calamari, well, when they're not calamari, when they're squid swimming. Get to see all sorts of things on their own terms. And it's such a privilege to be able to do that. And to realize, something that I just didn't think about until many hours under the sea, that like every human being, like every cat, every dog, every horse, every fish is unique. They're all different. Every one has its own arrangement of spots. They all have different attitudes, different behaviors. It's a staggering thought when you think every shrimp is different from every other shrimp, but ask anybody who works on the genetics of life. They'll tell you, of course it's true. They all have their own genetic footprints or fingerprints. Getting out to see sargassum floating in the ocean other than just washed up on the beach where people think it's a dreaded nuisance. But it's one of those living systems, a floating golden forest, grabbing carbon dioxide, generating oxygen, providing home for many creatures that live. Not that one, sorry, you'll see it soon. Yeah. And in a living system that, you think of the ocean, think of water as just water, but it's not. Water is alive. Creatures in every drop. There, one of the creatures that lives in the sargassum, calling those floating forests home. Well, this is the underwater space that I was in when I had an opportunity to call Dr. Lane. This was a few years ago, but the first time I had a chance to live underwater was in 1970. It was a year, almost to the day, after the first footprints were put on the moon. In fact, we emerged from the so-called Tektite underwater laboratory on the 20th of July, 1970. Well, I've done it now 10 times, living underwater, most recently in July of this past year, back to Aquarius, the underwater laboratory. Some call it the electrified reef because scientists come and plug in all their fancy instruments and go outside. You can be inside their bunks, their is a little kitchen, there's a hot shower, all the comforts of a little trailer. You can be dry inside. You're living under pressure. It's the same pressure, essentially, as what is outside. You saturate your system with the compressed air that you're breathing. And then, at the end of a few days or a week or 10 days or whatever, however long you want to stay, you decompress all at once. Meanwhile, the ocean is your laboratory. Here's one of my science colleagues who studies coral reefs, Mark Patterson, who has looked at this particular reef for off and on the last 20 years. It's a long-term monitoring station in the sea. Hundreds of scientists have done their research there. We have snapshots that together put together an image of change over time. Good news, because a lot of the elements that were there 20 years ago are still there. Some not so good news. It's really hard to find a lobster now on this reef, because we love to eat lobster. We've done a really good job of consuming them, and sharks and grouper and a lot of other things. But think of it, there's this magic mirror in the floor of Aquarius. You step through it and you're in the ocean. Or the other way around. You step from the ocean through that magic mirror into a warm, dry place inside. It's just a wonderful asset. It's a space station in the sea, inhabited by lots of creatures, including Goliath grouper, who seem to be on the way out because, again, we had such an appetite for them that they were almost gone until they received protection. And now they seem to be coming back in greater abundance. Good news. Well, astronauts have discovered Aquarius. They train there. They not only train here in Houston at the big swimming pool, where this image was taken, to feel what it's like to be weightless before actually going up in space. Again, if you haven't done it, don't deprive yourself of the joy of being out there in the ocean, to meet the fish on their own terms and to fly underwater. Well, any astronaut will tell you, you have to learn everything you can about your life support system, and then you have to do everything you can to take care of your life support system. They know it. I know it when I go down in the ocean, and the air that I love to breathe is way up there somewhere. You carry a package of air with you, and you have to be really careful that the systems work when you take yourself away from those systems that provide life support. Well, astronauts know, especially viewing Earth from high in the sky, Earth is our life support system. We have to do everything we can to learn about it, and do everything we can to take care of it. It's not too big to fail. Well, holding your breath, it's possible to go, some people can go 100 meters underwater on a single breath of air. They can't stay very long, but they can do it. Whales, of course, can go deeper and stay longer than humans can, with sperm whales managing to stay sometimes an hour on a single breath of air, going as much as a mile. But the average depth of the ocean is 2.5 miles, and the maximum 7 miles. If we are to get to know our own blue backyard, get to know the ocean, we have had to harness technology to do so. And Oceaneering International, a company that's had a long history here in Houston, had a vision years ago that this piece of equipment that was actually designed in the 1920s, but was reconfigured in the 1970s to actually work on rigs, pipelines, to gain access to the sea. And when the National Geographic tapped me to do a story, actually a book about ocean exploration, I discovered the existence of this one atmosphere diving suit called JIM. Not like the gym that you go have a basketball game. This is JIM, named after the first person willing to put it on, Jim Jarrett. Many years later, I had a chance to put it on and go for a dive to 400 meters, 1,250 feet off the coast of Hawaii, and to spend 2.5 hours on the bottom, just walking around, coming back to the surface, no decompression. Such an amazing feeling to be able to do it. For me, it was an inspiration I'm a scientist, basically, but to step outside a bit and start a company, and then a second company, and then a third company, all geared to developing technologies to gain access to the sea. I was so inspired by the concept, and yet so frustrated by the lack of access to the sea. There's one little submarine that is a workhorse that takes scientists into the sea, the Alvin, that was launched in 1964 and will soon be relaunched, able to go back for another round of expeditions in the sea. The Johnson Sea Lynx submarines that really have transported hundreds of scientists to go to 1,000 meters, about the depth that William Beebe and Otis Barton achieved going back to the 1930s, but with a clear sphere like this, not a steel ball, but with a visibility so that it doesn't even look as though you're kept from the water. It looks like, you're in a little aquarium with a fish on the outside and you on the inside. So this little submarine called Deep Rover was one of the products that was developed by the first company that I was involved with, Deep Ocean Engineering. We built hundreds of robots and 3 little submarines, 1 person, 2 person, and this is a descendant of that submarine. It's called Deep Rover, built in Canada. I mean, there are about 20 of these in existence. We used them during the 5-year Sustainable Seas expeditions with partners in Mexico, going all around the Gulf of Mexico, in the state side and the Mexican side, and elsewhere around the country as well, over a 5-year period, to explore what we could down to as much as 2,000 feet, and using the Deep Rover down to 1,000 meters. I mean, they're so simple to drive that even a scientist can do it, and I'm living proof. A 10-year-old kid got in and drove it around. There's a 2-person version. There are 3-person subs that I love. This one is in Costa Rica. But you put all of the submarines that exist in the world that can transport people into the deep, and it's still a very small fleet. We have, at this point, we're experiencing probably the equivalent of the early days of aviation. You know, think of where we were in the 1930s, the Lindbergh era, when every trip was a great adventure. Well, it's true now with going into the ocean in a submarine. Every trip is a great adventure. This is a 5-person system built in Italy to take passengers. There are certainly 30-passenger submarines, even a 60-passenger submarine to take tourists underwater. We don't have one in the Gulf of Mexico yet, but maybe someday. This is the little Alvin. Takes 3 people down to the average depth of the ocean, 2.5 miles. This is its last glimpse before it was taken into dry dock to get reconfigured, diving here in the Gulf of Mexico after the Deepwater Horizon spill to go down one of the few submarines in the world that could go as much as a mile beneath the surface. You can go a mile up in the sky, or this way, you could do it on 1 foot, 1 mile almost. But going down, it's still tricky business. Lots of robots can do it, but there is a distinctive difference in sending the human mind and the human presence into any situation as compared to sending robots. A great oceanographer once observed, you can't surprise a machine. Kathy Sullivan, who loves Houston, has an honorary degree from this university, and as an astronaut, first American woman to walk in space, she said, robots don't have any sense of humor. And they can't tell you why they want to go. I can tell you why I want to go. Just before Christmas this year, I had a chance to use the little Pisces, one of the 2 Pisces subs. They've been around since the 1970s, but they're still in great shape. This one has another 20 years of good left in it, at least. It's used by the University of Hawaii. There are 2 of them. There are 2 of the systems that can go as deep as the Deepwater Horizon. The number in the world are not that great. It can go to 2,000 meters. What's stopping us? There are wonderful things out there, aside from serving industry, aside from just doing what has inspired much of the technology that gives us access to the sea, that but for the oil and gas industry and for military applications, scientists would not have what we now enjoy in terms of access to the sea. Saturation diving, living underwater. There's a lot of that going on in places. Norway uses saturation diving all the time for what is required to get people, real live human beings, down to service oil rigs and other installations underwater. But for the science community, we have a long way to go to catch up, but thanks to the investment made by industry, we have a lot of the tools and a lot of the information that otherwise would not be there. I remember reading many years ago about samples taken in deep water off the Norwegian coast of deep water corals. And later, the oil industry began to discover in deep water the existence of these deep water corals. Now that we know, actions can be taken and are being taken to protect some of these areas so that they're going to be around far into the future. One thing that we didn't know until recently is how old some of these corals are. Where I was exploring a few weeks ago off Hawaii, we saw some of the oldest living creatures on Earth. Gold coral, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 years old. Think of what the world was like 7,000 years ago. Think of what it was like when you were a kid. Think of what it's like today. And look at what's happening elsewhere in the world. Russia now has 6 submarines that can go to as deep as 6,000 meters. That's deeper than anything that we now have that's operational in this country, other than there are a few robots that can go that deep, but a manned system, no. I used this system in Lake Baikal a few years ago with Jim Cameron. On his birthday, we went down to explore the bottom of Lake Baikal. And in October this past year, I visited in China their contender, the deepest manned multi-passenger submarine in existence. 3 people can go to 7,000 meters. And this year, the Sea Dragon, Zhailong, is launched on an expedition to explore the South China Sea, in dispute with Japan, but also to explore the oceans of the world. Japan, with their 6,500 meter submersible, Shinkai 6,500, they're embarked on a year-long expedition, they say, to look for the origin of life. Of course, if they find some mineral deposits, I guess that's a dividend. They let me get inside the Sea Dragon and peer out and dream about what it must be like to go 7,000 meters down, or 11,000 meters. Jim Cameron, that manipulator arm was built by the 3rd company that I've started, that my daughter and son-in-law own and operate now, but it has been to the deepest place in the ocean, but I haven't. Darn. Maybe someday. In fact, someday, maybe we all will have the ability to buy a ticket and travel into the deepest part of the ocean. It's only 7 miles, 11 kilometers. What are we waiting for? Some say, and I've tried for years to get people excited about going below 6,000 meters or even to 6,000 meters. And I've had some very serious admirals say to me, it's only 3% or maybe even only 2% of the ocean that you can't get to that's below 6,000 meters. Between 6,000 and 11,000, it's a lot of depth, a lot of unique environment, but it's not very much area. And I say, yeah, it's only as big as the United States that we're leaving on the table, unexplored, unaccounted for. What are we thinking? Or you could say it's an area as big as China, or as big as Australia, the country of your choice, as big as Canada, that we don't have access to. But Jim Cameron, filmmaker and explorer, had the gumption, a private citizen, private individual with private money, working ultimately with the National Geographic and Rolex, to mount the expedition that was successful last March, to go for the 2nd time in history, first time 1960. Had to wait another 50 years before somebody was able to go back to the deepest place in the sea. So, excuse me if I'm enthusiastic about, mobilizing whatever it takes. I think it's going to take private support, a constituency that starts it, and maybe government agencies in this country will follow. Other countries aren't waiting. They're moving into it. China's going to build an 11,000 meter system. They're already embarked on that project, and I'm sure that Russia, I'm told at least, that they are similarly. They're not going to leave a continent-sized piece of real estate on the table. We are just beginning to realize that we who have coastal areas, including, of course, the United States, big blue backyards. In fact, the part of this country that is submerged is greater than the part that's above water. I'm not talking post-Katrina or Sandy. I'm talking this part out 200 miles from the shore. It's our exclusive economic zone. And right now, we're just beginning to appreciate the value. And I don't mean what we can put into it or what we can take out of it, but the services provided by the blue part of this country, the blue part of the world. And if you draw a line around all the countries and their exclusive economic zones, what's left, the high seas, it's about half the world. That is the Wild West. That's a challenge of our time. Every one of you has an equal vested interest in what happens, like every other citizen of the world. It's the global commons, like the skies above, global commons. We have the challenge of figuring out, are we going to let it just be randomly exploited by a handful of countries or entrepreneurs who will get out there first and take before we're able to figure out the importance of what's there to all of us? I hope not, but this is the moment. Why, on the balance sheet, this is the most important time in all of history, because for the first time we know what we couldn't know a few decades ago. And if we wait and don't act another 10 years or 20 or 50 or 100, we will miss the window of opportunity that's now available to us. This, an engineer might say, is the sweet spot in time. First time that we know, the last time we'll have to really do what's now possible. Well, we still have a chance. So, let's get out there. Let's get down there. Let's build little submarines. They cost more than a sports car. Well, not all sports cars. Some cost less than the fanciest of sport cars. So, let's go exploring. These are just concepts. Well, the top remotely operated vehicle is not a concept. One has just been delivered that goes to 6,000 meters to the University of Hawaii, another 2,000 meters that goes to Scripps Institution of Oceanography to explore. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution has developed a robot that goes to full ocean depths, but it didn't make the same headlines that Jim Cameron's depth dive down, solo dive. People care about what people are doing directly. Even though Nereus, that wonderful robot developed by Woods Hole, has been to the deepest part of the ocean 9 times, who knows about it? Who knows what discoveries they've made? It's exciting stuff. They found life with every glimpse of what they saw down there and the samples they brought back. But, somehow people want to look over the shoulders of astronauts and over the explorers who go into the sea. James Cameron has said famously, "Little kids do not want to grow up to be robots. They want to be explorers." There's something to that. Whatever means we use, we need all of those tools. We need the technologies that will get us into the depths to see what other nations are diving down to see, scrambling to lay claim to the Arctic, to the high seas, to extend their boundaries out beyond the formal 200-mile zone into more ocean, more claim, more stuff. This is the first time we've been able to do that, to see ourselves in perspective. You can't see the boundaries when you're up there in the sky. They're things that we make up, exclusive economic zones, the borders among countries. But it's the way humans operate. We have allocations for how many fish we can take from the sea. When I was chief scientist at NOAA, I got the news that 90% of the bluefin tuna were gone from the Atlantic. Well, the news just last week from the Pacific is that 96% of the bluefin tuna are gone. Why? Because they taste so good. And one bluefin tuna in January of this year sold in the Tokyo fish market for $1.8 million, one fish. I used to say, someday Somebody will pay $1 million for the last tuna. Well, we still have some tuna out there. There's still a chance to not see them disappear over the edge forever, even though they taste good and every bite is worth, gazillions. We still have a chance to understand that their real value is not in how good they taste, but what they provide in the ocean. Same is true in Antarctica. You can look at all those little shrimpy things they call krill in Antarctica. There's some in the Gulf of Mexico too, and in the Arctic. But the first thing that humans have a tendency to do when they see something they haven't seen before, is it good to eat, or is it going to eat me? Well, in this case, we aren't even eating krill. We're just taking them as products, and in the process, pulling the cornerstone out of a whole ecosystem. In this case, the penguins aren't very happy about our pressures as people on their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, krill. Orange roughy, deep sea fish, relatives here in the Gulf of Mexico, that we never exploited until we had access to the sea to extract them. This little fish that you see may be that big. It takes 30 years to mature, maybe a century old before it appears in your grocery store or on the menu of your local restaurant. Some have been dated to be as much as 200 years old. And their numbers were here when I was a kid. Their numbers today are like this because we're mining them from the ocean. We didn't know. We didn't know that sharks were anything good but dead. The only good shark was a dead shark when I started diving. But now we know that yes, shark fin soup can sell for a lot, but it doesn't matter what the price is. Even $1 million for a bowl of soup, it doesn't cost that yet. But try to make a shark for $1 million. We don't know how to do that. Even with all the genetic manipulation that we've got, we haven't been able to stitch a creature back together again once it's disappeared. This little nondescript little silvery critter, some of you will recognize. I know Larry McKenney recognizes menhaden, some of the rest of you do too, does not appear on your plate, but it's on the diet of many of the creatures that live in the sea, and the birds, fish. It was on the menu for sure of a creature that once lived in the Gulf of Mexico. It doesn't live there anymore. That's the monk seal. Did you know there was a seal that used to come as far north as Galveston? Throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Gulf of Mexico, the last one seen when I was in high school in 1952. No more, they're gone. There's some relatives in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, there's some relatives in the Mediterranean, but we're deprived of ever seeing a monk seal of the sort that once was here. But they used to scarf up menhaden like many other things. Menhaden are wonderful filter feeders like oysters, clams, and sponges. They do this wonderful job of opening their big mouths and spreading their gills, and they slurp up the plankton, and it turns into protein. And they get the omega-3s that you get from menhaden, from taking it out of the plankton. And they leave the water much cleaner as a consequence. Have you ever had your swimming pool go green? Chesapeake Bay has done exactly that, as we've taken the oysters, the clams, and the menhaden, and we've not only taken away the filtration system, we've added nutrients beyond what the system can bear. But hey, the good news is now we know. When I was a kid, the first rig went into the Gulf of Mexico to begin to tap in to sources of energy. And we have benefited handsomely as a consequence of that energy. When you think of all the benefits that have come from what we thought of as cheap oil, cheap energy, and gas and coal, we have prospered. Civilization has gone from where it was to unprecedented levels of prosperity, largely a gift of our capacity to extract these sources of energy. We couldn't know what we know. The internet, having satellites in the sky, transporting me here, transporting all of us wherever we go these days, is largely dependent on our new capacity to tap into these sources. And yes, we have discovered there are some problems. And it is something that puts a new light on the real cost of what we have thought of as cheap energy. But now we know, and now we are inspired to think differently about how to go about the process, to be, now that we understand what some of the problems are, again, you can solve problems if you know what they are. The real problem is not knowing. But now we know the connection between burning fossil fuels and what's happening to the atmosphere. Now we know about what's happening to changes in storm patterns. We're beginning to suspect, to connect the dots and see how our actions are altering the nature of nature. We used to think of mangroves as something in the way of our view, or something you had to turn over in order to get a housing development or a parking lot along the coast. But the real value of mangroves now we're beginning to understand is not just a habitat, not just because some of us think they're really cool and beautiful and all that, because they're great carbon capturers, oxygen generators. It's been determined in recent times that mangroves can capture as much as 50 times the amount of carbon as their terrestrial counterparts. So those roots down in the ocean that hold carbon and make these great sediment deposits, a nice bank analogy again. Seagrass meadows, once thought disposable, expendable, not of any great importance, but now we know. Like marshes, like the mangroves, they're great storm barriers, natural ones. We're putting a value on that. The whole idea that is catching hold here in Texas of the Lone Star Coastal National Recreation Area is such a good idea to connect the dots with mangroves, with seagrass meadows, with upstream areas, with private holdings, with willing individuals to work with those who are stitching together this concept. It is an idea whose time has come, just as having the national park system was an idea whose time had come early in the 20th century, and we need more of that, more ways to expand and protect the natural systems that take care of us. One of the aspects of this Lone Star coastal concept is the nesting areas for creatures that once were thought to be right on the edge of going the way of the monk seals, the Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. But before it was too late, people woke up, began to protect the nesting areas, began to stop killing the turtles, not just the Kemp's Ridley, but the other 7 variations on the theme of sea turtles. So today, there are turtles coming back, and the nests are being protected. The turtles that come to Galveston lay their eggs. Right now, some of them are being transported. I guess they're all taken out to Padre Island, but I guess if you could ask the mama turtle, she'd say, well, I thought this was the best place for them. Why don't you agree with me and leave them here and let them grow up where I intended for them to? Well, maybe we'll listen to the mama turtles. At Flower Garden Banks, this great place 100 miles south of where we're sitting right now, out in the Gulf of Mexico, Larry McKinney and I, last summer, had a chance to see this loggerhead turtle sleeping. Well, we were out there at night observing life way out there and under the sea. We're giving them a break, and it's paying off. You know, years ago, we decided to invest in aviation, aerospace. It's paid off handsomely. We have neglected the ocean, and it's costing us dearly. But now we know. We know the value of this little place that was protected during the George H.W. Bush administration when I was chief scientist at NOAA. The Flower Garden Banks came into existence. It's a tiny place, but it's cause for hope in the Gulf of Mexico. Those rigs that are out there, in some ways, once they have ended their productive life, extracting energy from the depths of the Gulf of Mexico, are proving to have another life as a steel archipelago of creatures, 4 creatures who set up housekeeping there. I hope we'll really look with new eyes on these structures and figure out a sensible way to maintain them, maybe as scientific places to study, to put instruments. Scientists couldn't afford to put this steel archipelago in place, but we can certainly adapt them for good scientific use. Certainly the sponges and the corals and the turtles and other creatures have already decided to do that. On my watch, and on yours too, about half the coral reefs in the world have either disappeared or they're in a state of sharp decline. The reasons are many. We've extracted the fish, we've extracted the lobsters, we've added stuff to the ocean, we've pushed the envelope in terms of temperature. Many reefs suffer from coral bleaching, including in the Gulf of Mexico and onto the Caribbean. About 80% of the coral reefs in the Caribbean are gone. In my time, in your time, the last 30 years has been a time of remarkable change. So this is a time as never before, and maybe as never again, when we can take action, because now we know we can map the currents and share the news in ways that all of those oceanographers in the past could only dream about. We can see the sands of Africa coming across the country and landing in the Gulf of Mexico. We can see what we're putting into the Gulf, putting into the oceans of the world, the trash. It's coming back now to haunt us. It certainly haunts the creatures who live in and by the ocean, such as this image of an albatross who has been fed by its well-intended parents, little bits of plastic. You go out to Padre Island or along the Galveston coast, but it was here in Texas that a kid, a young woman, walking the beaches, was so stressed by seeing all this junk on the beaches that she didn't ask anybody. She didn't get her friends. She just started picking it up. Linda Marinas. And people started watching her do this. And one thing led to another. And over time, a movement began here in Texas that now has caught on around the world. The coastal cleanup. It's an idea whose time is, now that we've got the problem, we've got part of a solution. We have to stop the upstream source, but we can also take out what we've put in. So, this time last year, I was half a world away, out at Midway Island, having a conversation with one of these seabirds, a Laysan albatross, who's sitting on her most recent egg. She's been given a name. Her name is Wisdom. She was named in the 1950s. She's now, 62 years old at least, sitting on her most recent egg. In fact, the egg that she just laid this year has just hatched. We call that egg Hope. We call her Wisdom. What has she seen in her lifetime? What have you seen in yours? She cannot know the causes of the changes to which she has been witness, but I know, we have the power of understanding. There are a lot of smart creatures out there, not just wily birds that can live for 6 decades and plus. Elephants are smart, dolphins are smart, whales are smart. Some people are too. We have the power of knowing, and we also have the power of caring. You can't care, though, if you don't know. Now we know, because geologists have been giving us some answers about our history. Anthropologists, look, the history of humankind goes way back, millions of years. How many millions? It's still a matter of debate, but we do know that humans, much the way we are today, you could take someone from 100,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago, certainly from 10,000 years ago as a baby and might emerge as a graduate of Rice University. They've got the ingredients to do so. Physically, mentally, we haven't changed that much in all this time. The world has changed. There have been ups and downs, but the last 10,000 years since the end of the last ice age, reasonably stable. This is the time of our great prosperity, when civilization has gone from a few of us to a lot of us. Now, 7 billion of us. Our capacity to alter the nature of the world that has given us this great era of prosperity is now ahead of us. That's the good news, in a way, that we know these things. what no other creature on Earth can know, what no other humans in the past could know, this, the sweet spot in time. To borrow a phrase from a recent presidential address, President Obama said, "Our highest priority must be to make the world safe for our children." Well, he was talking about guns. I'm talking about the ocean. I'm talking about our Gulf of Mexico. It's our highest priority. Let's keep it safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. We have time for just a few questions. The schedule is tight. There are microphones on either side, so please do come to the microphones if you have a question, but we will have to keep them short and the answers short. So I do have a question over here on the right.
Oh, I can stand here right there. Is my mic on? Yes.
Very good talk. This strikes at the heart of what I think has gone too far, and that's a free market mentality, extraction-based. And I guess my question to you is, have you thought about the fundamental way that we can affect the morbidity that we have inflicted upon, and I speak to you as somebody from NOAA, the carbon cycle and the hydrologic cycle. And where I'm going with this is, for example, I don't want to eat fish anymore. Why? It's got too much mercury. And what happened is, coal-fired plants, for example, are the biggest offenders of sticking mercury in the atmosphere. It rains, it washes, it runs off into the ocean. Fish get a lot of mercury, you got a lot of neurological problems. But again, I see the hand, yeah. Have you had any, like brainstorming thoughts, whether alone or in a group, about how we may remediate the, again, morbidity that we've inflicted upon the carbon cycle and the hydrologic cycle?
The answer, I believe, starts with appropriately valuing the natural systems. I got into trouble once in a while when I was at NOAA for a variety of things. One of them was because I used to tell the guys at the National Marine Fisheries Service that they only considered fish of any value when they're dead, that a live fish had a zero accounting base. Once they were killed, then you could sell them and they had a value. It's true of all natural systems. We have thought of them as zero accounting base. They're free. They're free. Exploit them at our will. Now we know, and that's the hope, that we're beginning. It was certainly a hot topic at Davos a year ago, this year as well. It's a hot topic all over the place. Let's figure out, what's it worth? What's a marsh worth? What's a whale worth, alive versus a whale worth? What's a menhaden worth? You can sell them, or to all of us, there's a real value in having menhaden there in great abundance, and the value of not having them, there's a cost. So we're just getting to that point of understanding how the system works and where we fit in. For me, the answer is in knowing why it matters.
I fill in the blank.
I'm sorry, I need to take another
just
question.
one more
I need
thing.
to take another question on the other side. Thank you very much for your
But
question.
we'll talk after, Carlos. Yeah.
We got time for two more quick questions, please.
Yes, there's a little polygonal area in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico beyond the limit of everyone's economic zone. Is there anything that we ought to keep in mind as development moves towards that, which is much like the rest of the open ocean, but probably sooner to be approached with development? And although it's unratified, is there anything about the law of the sea that we ought to keep in mind that we wouldn't otherwise think about.
I wish James Baker were here. He's the great negotiator. We need to fire him up and get him out there to get us at the table. It's a real frustration for many of us that we have not ratified the law of the sea. We're a handful of nations that aren't at the big table. I mean, we are at the big table because we have such influence, but we still need to use our voices and let it be known that we really want this. As Lincoln said that when the public is with you, anything's possible. If the public's not with you, nothing's possible. We need the public to say, we really need to do this. And that voice hasn't yet been raised. And the other point about the high seas part of the Gulf of Mexico, it's a long, skinny, hourglass-shaped thing. If it were my decision to make, I'd say, let's make it a peace park, if you will. It's the place between three nations that all have a common interest in. We can figure out what the boundaries are and what our policies are within our own exclusive economic zones, but at least for this little patch, why don't we agree to leave it alone? Just leave it alone and let the natural systems prosper there. Unfortunately, some decisions have already been made about how to carve it up, but it's, we can always rethink these issues if people make it known that they care, and that's the key.
On that note, in Roger Scruton's recent book on how to think seriously about the planet, he talks about environmental change needing to come from the human scale and from the valuation of the natural world as more than just dead product, but as something that contributes to each human's sense of self-worth and identity and even home feeling. And I was wondering, what can we do to bring about this feeling in people and to make people more aware that when they destroy something, they're not destroying it for just their future generations or just the past, but for themselves as well, and are ruining their own home in that sense?
Well, you've just put the issue in perspective, and that I think what can be done is being, in a sense, done through the power of communication. And it's one of the great reasons for hope. If you don't know, you have an excuse. But once you've got the message, once you know, you can never look back. You're burdened with knowledge. I am burdened with knowledge based on thousands of hours underwater. I can't look at the ocean the same way I did when I was a kid. Now, the explosion of information that is available to people everywhere. Now, you have to be savvy enough to know what's sound and what's not. But overall, just the access to knowledge, those solid images, the scientists who report the information that we get that come from all over the world, and we can see the world and see the cause and effect, that, I think, should be real reason for hope. And people can get other people on board in ways that were not possible even 5 years ago. I think, and this is probably, if we're going to close now, this is the moment. The next 10 years may be the most important, influential time in the next 10,000 years. We should really embrace it and enjoy it. Why not? It's our time.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Sylvia Earle.